An African-American man named Dre is walking alone at night through a quiet suburban street. After a minute, a white sports car pulls up and starts to follow him slowly. Dre becomes scared, so he turns around and begins walking quickly in the opposite direction. When he glances back, the car is still there, but the door is now open. Suddenly, a man wearing a medieval helmet attacks Dre and drags him into the car. The scene then cuts to Rose, who shows up at her photographer boyfriend Chris's apartment with pastries and coffee. They're preparing to go away for the weekend to visit her family. Chris is worried they might not like that she's dating a black man. Rose assures him that, while they may say some silly things, they are very progressive. He asks her if he's the only African-American man she's ever dated, and she confirms that he is. She tries to reassure him, jokingly saying, "Don't worry, it's not like they're going to kill you." On their way to her parents' house, Chris reaches for a cigarette, but Rose takes it and throws it out the window, mentioning that her parents wouldn't approve of smoking. Chris calls his friend Rod, who works as a TSA agent, to ask him to take care of his dog and not feed it human food. Rod jokes about Chris going to visit white people and warns him that it's a bad idea, even flirting with Rose a little. Chris gets slightly jealous, but Rose finds it cute. While they're distracted talking, a deer runs out in front of their car and they hit it. They pull over to check on the situation and call the police. When the officer arrives, he asks Chris for his ID, even though Rose was driving. Rose challenges the officer, saying it's unnecessary since Chris wasn't driving, and the officer eventually lets them go. Chris appreciates Rose standing up for him, but the incident still feels tense. Later, they arrive at her parents' home. Rose's father, Dean Armitage, a friendly neurosurgeon, greets them warmly, proudly mentioning that he would have voted for Obama a third time if he could. Rose's mother, Missy, is a cold but polite hypnotherapist. She offers to help Chris quit smoking through hypnosis. But Chris is uncomfortable with the idea of anyone messing with his mind. The Armitages also have two black workers, Walter, the groundskeeper, and Georgina, the maid. Dean acknowledges that it doesn't look great, two wealthy white people employing two African Americans, but explains that Walter and Georgina were hired to care for his parents, and he didn't have the heart to let them go after his parents passed. Chris finds both Walter and Georgina unsettling, noticing their stiff, overly polite behavior and dated way of speaking. As Dean gives Chris a tour of the house, he points out old family photos and taps on the door to the basement, explaining that it's closed off because of black mold. There are also pictures of Rose's brother, who will be joining them later. Later, Chris, like his father, is a surgeon, or so he jokingly claims during afternoon tea. The whole family gathers, and Missy asks Chris about his parents. Chris shares that his dad left when he was young, and his mom was hit by a car when he was 11. While Missy tries to steer the conversation, Georgina, who's serving tea, suddenly malfunctions, spilling the tea. Missy tells her to go lie down and rest. Rose is reminded by her parents that tomorrow is the family's big day, which catches her by surprise. They remind her it happens on the same day every year. That evening, Rose's brother, Jeremy, arrives. He's rude and aggressive, nothing like the surgeon he's supposed to be. At dinner, Jeremy gets drunk and starts talking to Chris about MMA fighting, suggesting Chris would excel because he comes from a strong family. He pushes for a sparring match, but Chris calmly declines, saying he has a rule about fighting drunk people. Dean and Missy suggest that Jeremy call it a night, diffusing the tension. Later, Chris and Rose head to bed, and she apologizes for her family's behavior. After they fall asleep, Chris wakes up in the middle of the night and sneaks out for a cigarette. While outside, he sees something in the distance. Walter, the groundskeeper, is running full speed straight toward him, but veers off at the last second. Startled, Chris looks toward the house and notices Georgina staring out of a window. However, it turns out she's just looking at her reflection, adjusting her hair. Feeling uneasy, Chris heads back inside. Missy, who is still awake, catches him before he returns to the bedroom. She remarks that smoking is bad and offers to help him quit through hypnosis. Chris mocks the idea, but sits down, unaware that she's already beginning to hypnotize him, using her teacup as a focal point. She takes him back to the night his mom died, when he was 11 years old. He recalls how he was too scared to call the police when his mom didn't come home, choosing instead to sit and nervously dig his nails into the bedpost while watching TV. Present-day Chris mirrors this behavior, gripping the chair's arms. Missy tells him to sink, and young Chris sinks into his bed while current Chris falls into a black void. His consciousness is trapped in the sunken place, while his body remains motionless in the chair. The next morning, Chris wakes up feeling uneasy. He plugs in his phone because the battery is low and tells Rose that he thinks her mom hypnotized him to sleep. He has hazy memories of the night, but can't fully recall everything. The scene cuts to the next day, when wealthy friends of the Armitages start arriving for a large gathering. Chris receives numerous inappropriate comments from older white guests, such as remarks about his good build and jokes like, "If Tiger Woods can play golf, so can you." And black men are better in bed, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Chris sneaks away and meets a blind man named Jim Hudson. Jim tells him that the people at the party are fools. He's an art dealer, and Chris recognizes him. Jim mentions that he's a fan of Chris's photography work. He jokes about the irony of being a blind art dealer, but explains that he has a very good assistant who describes the art to him. He tells Chris that he envies his eyesight, as he had once tried photography but never succeeded. Chris continues mingling and eventually finds another African-American man, around his age. He tries to bond with him, but notices something off. The man introduces himself as Logan, the much younger husband of an older white woman. Chris realizes that Logan is actually Dre, the man from the start of the movie, but something about him seems different. Later, Chris discovers that his phone has been unplugged again. Growing more suspicious, he plugs it in and calls Rod to explain everything that's been happening. Rod jokes that Chris is in danger, saying, "White people love having sex slaves," and warns him to get out of there. Chris confronts Rose, telling her how strange everything has been, and mentions that someone keeps unplugging his phone. Rose tells Chris that he's just being paranoid. He agrees reluctantly, and she leaves. Rod advises Chris to take a picture of the African-American man to see if he recognizes him. Chris discreetly goes back outside to snap a picture, but he forgets to turn off the flash. The man's demeanor changes immediately once the flash goes off. His overly proper behavior vanishes, his nose starts to bleed, and he jumps at Chris, screaming, "Get out! Get out while you still can!" Rose is freaked out as well, and she asks her dad what just happened. Dean tells her the man had a seizure caused by the flash. The man soon returns, apologizing for his outburst and saying he needs to leave. Afterward, Chris and Rose go for a walk. During the walk, Chris tells Rose he's sure he knows the guy and that something strange is happening. She agrees that the outburst didn't look like a seizure at all. Chris insists he wants to leave, and although Rose is hesitant, she agrees to make up an excuse for her parents. Back at the house, a quiet and eerie bingo game is taking place. Dean holds up his fingers to indicate numbers, while the other guests show their bingo cards. A slow zoom out reveals that the bingo game is actually an auction, with a framed picture of Chris next to Dean. The guests are using bingo cards as paddles, and Dean's fingers raise the bid up to 10, presumably $10 million. The winner of the auction is Jim Hudson. Meanwhile, Chris returns to his room to pack. He gets a call from Rod, who tells him the man in the picture is Dre, a guy they knew who used to work at a movie theater but mysteriously disappeared. Before Chris can respond, his phone dies. He notices the closet door is slightly open and finds a red box inside. Inside the box are photographs of Rose in romantic poses with several African-American men, as well as photos of her with Walter and Georgina, who now look completely different from the robotic versions Chris has encountered. Shocked, Chris realizes he's not the first African-American man Rose has been involved with. Rose appears, and Chris urgently tells her they need to leave. He asks for the car keys as they head toward the door. Rose pretends to search for the keys in her purse, while Jeremy stands by, ready to attack. Missy and Dean instruct Jeremy to stay calm, while Chris grows increasingly frantic, yelling at Rose to find the keys. After a few tense moments, Rose stops pretending. She calmly holds up the keys, revealing that she's in on the whole scheme. Jeremy lunges at Chris, and Missy taps the teaspoon on a glass, sending Chris back into the dark void of hypnosis. As he sinks, he hears Dean telling Jeremy to grab Chris's legs so they can take him to the basement. Rose looks at Chris, blows him a kiss, and tells him he's one of her favorites. Meanwhile, Rod keeps calling Chris, but all his calls go straight to voicemail. Rod looks up the man in the photo and realizes that he went missing some time ago. Determined to help his friend, Rod goes to the police. He explains to a female officer that his friend has been kidnapped by white people to become a sex slave, just like the missing guy in the photo. She brings in 2 other officers to hear the story, but when he finishes, they all burst out laughing. No one at the police station takes Rod seriously. Meanwhile, Chris wakes up to find himself tied to a chair in a room with a mounted deer head and an old TV. A video plays of Dean's father talking about immortality and other strange topics. Chris notices that his fingernails have torn through the leather of the chair, exposing the padding. Soon, the teacup and spoon come back on the screen, causing him to fall unconscious again. Rod calls Chris's phone, but this time, Rose answers. She claims Chris left 2 days ago and says she's worried too, suggesting he might have taken a taxi or Uber. Rod mentions he went to the police, and Rose's tone shifts, showing concern. Rod, suspicious, tries to record the conversation. Rose then flirts with him, saying she knows he wants her. Rod quickly ends the call, calling her crazy. Chris wakes up again, and this time, Jim Hudson appears on the TV. Jim explains that they plan to swap brains. He wants to experience the world the way Chris does, particularly through his vision. Dean perfected the neurosurgery that makes this possible, and Missy's hypnosis prepares the body donors for the procedure. Jim reveals that the flash from Chris's phone earlier is an unfortunate side effect of the surgery. Before Chris can react, Missy clinks the spoon again, sending him back into unconsciousness. Dean and Jeremy prepare Jim for the brain transplant, and Dean instructs Jeremy to retrieve Chris. But unbeknownst to them, Chris isn't fully unconscious. He stuffed the chair padding in his ears to block the sound of the spoon. When Jeremy arrives, Chris knocks him out. Dean, realizing something is wrong, leaves the lab to check on Jeremy. Chris grabs a set of deer antlers from the other room and impales Dean, killing him. In the chaos, Chris knocks over a candle, setting Jim Hudson's blanket on fire. Rose, oblivious to the commotion, has her earbuds in. Chris heads upstairs and encounters Missy, who reaches for the teacup, but he smashes it before she can hypnotize him again. She attacks him with a knife, but Chris turns it against her, killing her. He tries to escape through the front door, but Jeremy revives and attacks him. Chris fights him off and kills Jeremy as well. He grabs Jeremy's car, finding the medieval helmet from earlier in the passenger seat. As Chris drives away, he accidentally hits Georgina. Feeling guilty for not helping his mom years ago, he decides to save her. He pulls Georgina into the car and continues driving, but she regains consciousness and attacks him. She screams that he's destroyed her family, and in the struggle, Rose starts shooting at them. Georgina's wig falls off, revealing a scar from a brain transplant. Georgina is actually Rose's grandmother. Chris crashes the car into a tree, killing Georgina. Rose, still armed with a gun, hunts Chris down. He pleads with her to stop, but she's more concerned about her grandmother in Georgina's body. Just then, Walter appears and tackles Chris. During the struggle, Chris grabs his phone and flashes the camera in Walter's face, causing Walter's nose to bleed, just like Dre earlier. Walter, now back in control, asks Rose for the gun. She hands it to him, but instead of shooting Chris, Walter turns the gun on Rose, shooting her in the stomach, then killing himself. Police lights appear on the road, and for a moment, it seems like Chris is doomed. But the car door opens, revealing Rod in a TSA patrol car. Chris gets in, leaving Rose to succumb to her wounds. After a brief silence, Rod tells Chris, "Man, I told you not to go into that house." They drive off, with Chris staring into the darkness, and that's where the movie ends.